When the landing gear jammed at 5,000 feet, what would you do? You're flying a 40-ton bomber, fuel running low, hydraulic fluid spraying across the cockpit instruments, and 23 men depending on your next decision? This is the story of one pilot's impossible choice that turned certain catastrophe into one of the most remarkable saves in aviation history. March 17th, 1945, the skies over war-torn Germany. Captain James Jimmy Doolittle Harrison, no relation to the famous Raider, commands a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, call sign Lady Luck, part of the 498th Bombardment Group. His crew has just completed their 14th mission over enemy territory, bombing industrial targets deep in the Ruhr Valley. They're heading home to RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, England. The mission seemed routine until it wasn't. At precisely 15:47 hours at 5,000 feet, everything changed. The hydraulic failure light blazed red. The landing gear refused to deploy. Captain Harrison had less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining. Captain James Harrison was 26 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Before the war, he'd been a crop duster, flying beat-up biplanes over cornfields for $15 a day. Now he commanded one of the most sophisticated aircraft ever built, a machine that cost $640,000, weighed 70,000 pounds fully loaded, and required a crew of 11 specialists to operate. The B-29 Superfortress represented the cutting edge of American aviation technology. The wingspan of 141 feet and powered by 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines producing 2,200 horsepower each. It was designed to deliver devastating payloads from altitudes unreachable by enemy fighters. But it was also notoriously complex, with hundreds of systems that could and often did malfunction. Harrison's crew that day consisted of men from all corners of America. First Lieutenant Robert Bobby Chen, the co-pilot, was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who'd fought discrimination to earn his wings. Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien, the flight engineer, was a Boston mechanic who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Staff Sergeant William Buck Thompson, the radio operator, had been a ham radio enthusiast who once contacted Australia from his basement in Kansas City. Each man was trained for specific emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. The 498th Bombardment Group had been stationed at RAF Lakenheath since January 1945, flying missions deep into German industrial heartland. By March, they'd lost 6 aircraft and 63 men, a grim reminder that even this late in the war, the sky remained a lethal battlefield. Every mission briefing began with the chaplain's prayer, and every mission ended with someone's bunk staying empty. Today's target had been the Krupp Steel Works in Essen, a massive complex that fed the German war machine. Intelligence indicated light fighter resistance, and the weather forecast promised clear skies, a milk run, the crews called it. They'd dropped their payload with precision, watched the explosions ripple across the factory complex, and turned for home. Harrison remembered thinking they might actually make it through this one without incident. He was wrong. The first indication of trouble came at 15:23 hours, when they were still over Dutch territory. Staff Sergeant O'Brien noticed a slight pressure drop in the number 3 hydraulic system, probably just a loose fitting. They'd had similar issues before. Patch it up back at base, maybe ground the bird for a day. Nothing to abort the mission over. But by 15:35 hours, the pressure had dropped 40%. O'Brien's experienced hands moved across the instrument panel, checking gauges, flipping backup switches. The hydraulic system powered everything: landing gear, flaps, brakes, bomb bay doors. Losing it meant losing control over the aircraft's most critical functions. "Skipper, we've got a real problem here," O'Brien's voice crackled through the intercom. "Number 3, hydraulic is hemorrhaging. I'm showing fluid spray in the wheel well. If we don't get pressure back, we won't have gear." Harrison acknowledged with the calm that only comes from hundreds of flight hours. "Can you isolate it?" "Working on it now." The crew fell silent, each man focused on his station, but acutely aware of the engineer's struggle. In the waist gunner position, Sergeant Thompson remembered his training. Hydraulic failure, emergency procedures. They drilled the scenario dozens of times on the ground. Hand crank the gear down manually. Simple in theory. But at 5,000 feet, with the aircraft vibrating from engine strain, and the temperature in the wheel well cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, nothing was simple. By 15:40 hours, they crossed into British airspace. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through broken clouds, a sight that usually brought relief to bomber crews. Home, safety, hot coffee, and a warm bed. But for the men aboard Lady Luck, the cliffs represented a different kind of deadline. They had perhaps 20 minutes before fuel exhaustion forced them down. "All stations, this is pilot. We're declaring an emergency. Number 3, hydraulic is gone. We'll attempt manual gear deployment." O'Brien: "Chen, get ready for the hand crank procedure." First Lieutenant Chen unbuckled and moved aft. The manual crank was located in a cramped compartment behind the bomb bay, a space barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. In peacetime, mechanics accessed it through an external panel. In flight, A crewman had to squeeze through a narrow passage, work the crank through 200 revolutions while the aircraft bucked and swayed, and hope the mechanical linkage still functioned. Chen wedged himself into position. His hands found the crank handle, a T-shaped bar of cold steel. He began turning. 1 revolution. 2, 3. The muscles in his arms burned. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the frigid air. "How's it going back there, Bobby?" Harrison's voice remained steady, but the crew could hear the tension underneath. "Crank's moving, but I'm not feeling any resistance. Something's not engaging." Chen's breathing came heavy through the intercom. 20 revolutions. 30. Still nothing. The mechanical system that should have forced the gear down wasn't responding. O'Brien studied the schematics he kept folded in his flight suit pocket. Years of mechanical work had taught him that systems fail for specific reasons. A linkage could shear, a cable could snap, gear could strip, but complete non-engagement. It suggested catastrophic damage, possibly from the hydraulic fluid fire they'd detected earlier. At 15:47 hours, Harrison made the call to RAF Lakenheath Tower. Lakenheath Tower. This is Army Air Force's Niner 743. Lady Luck, we are declaring an emergency. Hydraulic failure. Landing gear will not deploy. Request emergency equipment standing by. The tower controller's voice came back immediately. Professional, but urgent. Lady Luck, Lakenheath Tower. Copy your emergency. Fire and rescue are rolling. Runway 27 is cleared. Wind is 270 at 12 knots. You are cleared for straight and approach. What are your intentions? That question hung in the freezing air. What are your intentions? Harrison had 3 options, none of them good. Option 1, belly landing. Bring the B-29 down with gear up, slide across the runway on the aircraft's belly until friction stopped them. Survivable, but with the bomb bay doors potentially stuck open and 4,500 gallons of fuel sloshing in the wings, any spark could turn Lady Luck into an inferno. Belly landings killed more crews than enemy fire, the veterans whispered. Option 2, bail out. Order the crew to parachute. Save the men, lose the aircraft. Standard procedure for catastrophic failure over friendly territory. But at 5,000 feet, over English farmland dotted with villages, each parachute represented a potential tragedy below, and Harrison knew that ordering men to jump was admitting defeat, something his Iowa pride refused to accept without exhausting every alternative. Option 3, attempt a landing with partial gear. If they could get even one main gear down, just maybe they could manage a controlled crash. But partial gear meant asymmetric drag, potential cartwheel, instant death if they got the approach angle wrong by even a few degrees. The fuel gauge showed 14 minutes remaining. Maybe less if the engines were burning rich, which they probably were after 8 hours of combat operations. "Bobby, talk to me. Any change?" Harrison's hands gripped the yoke tighter. Chen's voice came back strained. "Skipper, I've turned this crank 200 times. Nothing. The gear's not moving. Think the linkage is completely severed." In the nose, Bombardier Lieutenant Frank Morrison had been quietly working through his own calculations. Morrison was a former engineering student at MIT, a man who thought in numbers and probabilities. He keyed his mic. "Skipper, I've been thinking, what if we use explosive force?" "Explain," Harrison said. "The gear doors are held by mechanical locks. If the hydraulics are dead, those locks are still engaged. But we've got compressed air bottles for the dicing system. If we could channel that pressure, hit the gear doors with a sudden shock, we might blow them open. Then gravity would drop the gear." O'Brien jumped in. "That's insane. The compressed air system isn't rated for that kind of pressure spike. We could rupture the lines, start a fire. We're going to crash anyway if we can't get gear down." Morrison shot back. "At least this gives us a chance." The debate raged for precious seconds. Each man knew the stakes. Each man had seen what happened when B-29s went down hard. The aircraft's magnesium components burned at temperatures that turned human bodies to ash in seconds. By 1552 hours, they were 15 miles from RAF Lakenheath. The fuel gauge needles kissed the red line. Harrison could see the runway in the distance, a gray stripe across green farmland. Emergency vehicles clustered at the approach and fire trucks, ambulances, command cars, an audience for whatever came next. "All right, listen up." Harrison's command voice cut through the chatter. "We're going to try Morrison's idea. O'Brien, rig the compressed air system to feed the gear bay. Morrison, you'll trigger the release on my mark. Everyone else secure for emergency landing. Tighten every strap. Remove anything sharp from your pox. We'll have about 30 seconds to get stable before touch. If it doesn't work, ... Topo quotes. If it doesn't work, it's been an honor flying with you men." The crew responded with tight acknowledgments. No jokes, no false bravado. Just men preparing for the moment when training either saved them or failed them. O'Brien's hands moved with practiced speed, disconnecting the dicing air feed, rerouting it through temporary connections. He jury-rigged from spare hydraulic fittings. It was amateur-hour engineering, the kind that would earn a court-martial if anyone survived to report it. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "Systems rigged," O'Brien reported. "But Skipper, I'm not kidding about the fire risk. If these fittings blow under pressure, we'll have superheated air spraying across hot engine components. It could ignite remaining hydraulic fluid. Noted, Morrison. Are you ready? Ready, Skipper. Harrison began the landing checklist, the familiar litany that preceded every approach. But this time, half the items came back negative. Hydraulic pressure, negative. Landing gear indicator, negative. Flap control, negative. 8. They were flying a crippled machine held together by courage and improvisation. At 15:55 hours, with fuel for perhaps 8 minutes remaining, Lady Luck crossed the boundary fence of RAF Lakenheath at 1,000 feet. Too high, too fast. But Harrison needed altitude in case the gear actually deployed. The sudden drag would slow them dangerously if they were too low and slow already. Tower, this is Lady Luck. Beginning emergency procedure now. Copy, Lady Luck. Godspeed. Harrison's voice filled the intercom. On my mark, 3.2.1. Mark. Morrison hit the release. The compressed air bottles, normally fed at 120 psi for gradual dicing, suddenly dumped their entire volume 600 psi of explosive fours into the landing gear bay. The aircraft shuddered violently. Every gauge on the instrument panel jumped. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the fuselage, the safety valve blowing in the air system, exactly as O'Brien had feared. Fire warning, number 3 engine, Chen shouted. Harrison's eyes snapped to the indicator, red light blazing. Temperature gauge climbing into the danger zone. The superheated air had found something to ignite, probably residual hydraulic fluid coating the engine, nacelle. But in the same instant, every man aboard felt it a massive thud that reverberated through the airframe. The unmistakable sensation of 8,000 pounds of steel and rubber dropping into position. Gear doors open, main gear showing down. O'Brien's voice cracked with disbelief. We've got 2 green lights. Port and starboard mains are down and locked. A ragged cheer erupted on the intercom, instantly cut short by Harrison's next command. Nose gear status? Silence. Then O'Brien's voice, smaller. Still showing up, Skipper. We've got mains, but no nose wheel. The momentary hope evaporated. 2 out of 3 landing gear gave them something. But landing a B-29 with no nose gear was barely better than a belly land. The nose would drop the instant they touched down, slamming the forward fuselage into concrete at 70 miles per hour. The cockpit would crumple. The men sitting in the nose section, Harrison, Chen, Morrison, and Navigator Lieutenant Donald Baker, would absorb the impact directly. Can we hand crank the nose gear? Chen asked, already knowing the answer. Negative, O'Brien replied. Nose gear uses a different system. Pure hydraulic, no manual backup. The fire warning light continued blazing. Harrison had to make another impossible choice. Shut down number 3 engine now, and risk losing power on approach, or leave it running and hope the fire didn't spread. He left it running. You need every bit of thrust to maintain control during the landing. 800 feet altitude, 6 miles from touchdown. The B-29 settled into its approach. The 2 main landing gear creating asymmetric drag that tried to yaw the aircraft to the left. Harrison fought the controls, using differential throttle to keep the nose pointed straight. His arms ached from the constant pressure required to hold the yoke. Sweat soaked his flight suit despite the cold. Fuel state is critical, Chen called. It's maybe 4 minutes remaining. 4 minutes. 240 seconds. Harrison did the mental math. At their current speed and descent rate, they'd touch down in approximately 90 seconds. If they could hold together that long, the runway loomed ahead, seeming to rise up to meet them. Harrison could see individual figures, now firefighters, in their silver suits. Ambulance crews standing beside their vehicles. The base commander's staff car positioned on the taxiway. All waiting, all watching, all stations. 30 seconds to touchdown. Brace for impact. Throughout the aircraft, men tightened their restraint harnesses until the straps bit into flesh. They removed their headsets, knowing the impact could snap necks if their heads were tethered. They placed their hands on the bulkheads in front of them, arms bent, ready to absorb forward motion, and they prayed. Staff Sergeant Thompson, the radio operator, found himself thinking about his wife Betty back in Kansas City. She was pregnant with their first child, due in June. Would he live to see his son or daughter? Would Betty get the telegram? The one that started the War Department regrets to inform you? In the tail gunner position, Sergeant Luis Mendoza from El Paso thought about the 37 missions he'd flown. 37 times he'd climbed into this aircraft, faced death, and returned. Was number 38 the unlucky one? The war in Europe was nearly over. Germany would surrender in weeks. The thought of dying now, so close to the end, seemed unbearably cruel. 500 feet. Harrison pulled the throttles back, bleeding off speed. Too fast and they'd cartwheel. Too slow and they'd stall. Drop from the sky like a stone. The B-29 wallowed through the air, responding sluggishly to every control input. The 2 main landing gear hanging below the wings created additional drag that made the aircraft want to pitch nose down. Harrison had to hold the yoke back, fighting the tendency. keeping the nose high. 300 feet. The runway's surface became visible in sharp, detailed concrete patches where repairs had been made. Rubber marks from previous landings, the white threshold markings that designated the touchdown zone. Fire spreading on number 3. O'Brien's voice cut through. Recommend immediate shutdown? Negative, Harrison responded. We need the power. 2 more seconds. 200 feet. Harrison could feel the ground effect now. The cushion of compressed air between the wings and the earth. The B-29 wanted to float, to resist settling. He pushed the yoke forward slightly, just enough to break the cushion without diving. 100 feet. Chun's hands hovered over the controls, ready to assist if Harrison needed it. But this was the captain's aircraft. The captain's crew, the captain's responsibility. Harrison would bring them home or die trying. 50 feet. Harrison pulled all 4 throttles to idle. The engine roar diminished to a whisper. The only sound now was the wind rushing over the wings and the quiet prayers of frightened men. 20 feet. Harrison hauled back on the yoke, raising the nose, trying to set the main gear down first. If he could hold the nose up long enough, dissipate some forward speed on the mains. Maybe when the nose finally dropped, it would be survivable. The main landing gear kissed the runway with a screech of rubber. Aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled fully onto the mains. Harrison held the yoke in his lap, arms quivering with effort, keeping the nose elevated. 70 miles per hour, 65, 60. But physics is unforgiving. With no nose gear to distribute the weight, with the center of gravity shifting forward as the aircraft slowed, the nose began to drop despite Harrison's desperate pull on the yoke. Brace. Brace, Harrison shouted. The B-29's nose struck the runway with a grinding roar of tortured metal. The forward fuselage crumpled like tinfoil. Cockpit instruments exploded inward. Glass shattered. Metal shrieked. The aircraft's forward momentum became a violent deceleration as the nose carved a furrow into the concrete. Then came the fire. Number 3 engine already burning, tore free from its mount. 1,200 gallons of aviation gasoline, pressurized by the impact, sprayed across the hot engine components. The fuel ignited instantly, sending a fireball 50 feet into the air. Inside the crippled bomber, the world had become chaos. The impact threw Harrison against his restraints hard enough to crack ribs. Chen's head snapped forward, slamming into the control panel, opening a gash that immediately filled his eyes with blood. Morrison, in the bombardier's nose position, took the worst of it. The entire nose section had accordioned, trapping him in a cage of twisted metal and broken plexiglass. In the rear of the aircraft, the crew experienced violent forward motion, but remained relatively intact. The tail section, designed to break away in crashes to aid survival, had absorbed much of the deceleration force. Smoke filled the fuselage within seconds. Acrid, black, suffocating smoke from burning hydraulic fluid, electrical insulation, and rubber. The crew had perhaps 30 seconds before fire consumed the entire aircraft. O'Brien reacted first. Despite the impact that had knocked the wind from his lungs, despite the smoke that burned his throat and eyes, his training took over. He unbuckled, grabbed the fire axe mounted beside his station, and began attacking the buckled fuselage wall that separated him from the cockpit. In the radio room, Thompson fought his way through smoke to reach the emergency exit hatch. His hands found the release lever, pulled it. Nothing. The impact had jammed the frame. Pulled again, putting his full weight into it. The hatch groaned, but didn't open. Hatch is jammed. Thompson screamed into the smoke. We're trapped. The tail gunner Mendoza had his own exit, the tail-wheel door, normally used for ground access. He dropped through it, hit the runway, rolled to his feet. He could see the inferno at the front of the aircraft. See the emergency crews rushing forward, hoses already spraying foam, but his crew was still inside. He ran back toward the burning bomb. What happened next would be discussed in Air Force safety briefings for decades to come. It would become a textbook example of crew coordination under impossible circumstances, and it would result in 3 men receiving the Soldier's Medal, the Army's highest award for heroism outside of combat. O'Brien's fire axe finally punched through the buckled bulkhead. Smoke poured through the opening like water from a broken dam. I couldn't see anything in the cockpit, just gray-black clouds and the orange glow of flames somewhere forward. Skipper? Chen? Can you hear me? O'Brien shouted into the smoke. Gah. Then Harrison's voice, weak but alive. Chen's unconscious. I can't get my leg free. Something's pinning me. O'Brien squeezed through the axe hole he'd created, tearing his flight suit on the jagged metal. The heat hit him like a physical force, sizzly 120 degrees in the cockpit and climbing. He could hear the roar of flames, feel the aircraft shifting beneath him as the fire weakened its structure. His hands found Chen first. The co-pilot was slumped over the controls, blood covering his face. O'Brien grabbed him under the armpits, dragged him backwards through the hole. Chen was a small man, maybe 140 pounds, but unconscious, he was dead weight. O'Brien's muscles screamed as he hauled the limp body through the narrow opening. "Someone grab him!" O'Brien shouted. Hands reached through from the other side, the waist gunners, the radio operator, working together. They pulled Chen through, carried him toward the rear exit that Mendoza had managed to force open from outside. O'Brien went back for Harris. The captain was pinned behind the crushed control column, his right leg trapped beneath the collapsed instrument panel. Blood soaked his flight suit, though O'Brien couldn't tell if it was from Harrison or Chen or both. "It's stuck," Harrison said through gritted teeth. "You need to go. Get out while you can." "Not happening, Skipper. We're all going home." O'Brien planted his feet against the bulkhead and grabbed the control column with both hands. He pulled. Nothing. The column was pinned by the collapsed roof structure, held in place by thousands of pounds of pressure. One man couldn't move it. Outside, the fire crews were pouring foam onto the burning engine, but the flames had spread to the wing fuel tanks. The base fire chief, a veteran who'd seen dozens of crashed bombers, made the agonizing calculation. Maybe 2 minutes before the aircraft exploded, he ordered his men to fall back to safe distance. But Mendoza hadn't fallen back. The tail gunner had found another axe from a fire truck, and he was attacking the cockpit from outside, trying to cut through to reach Morrison in the bombardier's nose. The plexiglass nose cone had shattered, leaving Morrison visible but unreachable, trapped in a prison of bent metal struts. "Don't move," Mendoza shouted to Morrison. "I'm cutting you out." Morrison, barely conscious, managed a weak thumbs up. Inside the cockpit, O'Brien realized he couldn't move the control column alone. He needed leverage. His eyes swept the smoke-filled space, looking for anything he could use. The fire axe. If he could wedge it under the column, use it as a lever. He retrieved the axe, jammed the blade under the control column, and pushed down on the handle with every ounce of strength he possessed. The column shifted a quarter inch, half an inch. Grayson gasped as the pressure on his leg changed. "That's it. Keep going," Grayson urged. O'Brien pushed until his vision blurred, until the muscles in his back felt like they would tear. The column shifted another inch, another. Then Harrison screamed a sound of pure agony as O'Brien wrenched his trapped leg free. The limb was mangled, obviously broken, but free. "Can you move?" O'Brien gasped. "I'll crawl if I have to." Together, they made their way toward the rear of the aircraft. Harrison dragging his shattered leg, O'Brien supporting him, both men choking on smoke that had turned the fuselage into an oven. Behind them, flames licked through the cockpit, consuming oxygen, feeding on everything combustible. They reached the emergency exit just as the starboard wing fuel tank ruptured. A geyser of aviation gasoline sprayed across the runway, ignited, and created a secondary fireball that engulfed half the aircraft. The base fire chief, watching from his command position, later said he'd never seen men move so fast. O'Brien and Harrison literally fell out of the aircraft, rolled away from the flames, and were grabbed by firefighters who dragged them to safety. But Morrison was still inside. Mendoza, his hands blistered from the heat, his lungs seared by smoke inhalation, had nearly cut through the metal framework trapping the bombardier. Just a few more cuts, just a few more seconds. But the fire was too close now, the heat too intense. His axe glowed red from the temperature. 2 firefighters rushed forward with cutting torches faster than axes, but dangerous near aviation fuel. They didn't care. Man was dying in there. The torches hissed. Molten metal dripped. Morrison, barely conscious, felt hands grab him, pull him through an opening that seemed impossibly small. He remembered thinking, this is how babies are born. Squeezed through impossible spaces into a new world. Then darkness took him. The crew of Lady Lucal 11 men lay on the grass beside the runway, coughing, bleeding, some unconscious, but alive, every single one alive. 60 seconds later, the B-29's remaining fuel tanks exploded. The blast flipped the aircraft's tail section into the air, sent debris flying 300 yards. The fireball rose 200 feet, visible from villages 10 miles away. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained of Lady Luck but a blackened skeleton of metal. In the base hospital, as medics treated burns, broken bones, and smoke inhalation, Captain Harrison made the rounds to every man's bed. His own leg was in traction. 3 fractures. Doctors said he'd never fly again, but he was alive to see each of his crew, to shake hands with those who could, to speak quiet words of gratitude to those who couldn't. When he reached O'Brien's bed, Urson found the flight engineer staring at his bandaged hands. 3rd-degree burns across both palms from the superheated axe handle. The doctors had said it would be months before he could hold a wrench again. "You saved my life, Mike," Harrison said simply. O'Brien looked up, his eyes red from smoke. "You would have done the same for any of us, Skipper. That's what crews do." Harrison thought about that. In the civilian world he'd left behind, people worked for paychecks, for personal advancement, for individual success. But up there, in that aluminum tube, 5,000 feet above the earth, they'd formed something different, something deeper. They'd become a crew 11 separate lives, forged into one collective will to survive. The investigation into the crash of Lady Luck revealed that the hydraulic failure had been caused by battle damage sustained during the bombing run, a piece of flak, smaller than a dime, that had punctured a hydraulic line. The damage was so minor that the flight engineer couldn't detect it during post-strike inspection. But over 2 hours of flight, That pinhole leak had drained the entire hydraulic system. The investigators praised Harrison's decision to attempt Morrison's compressed air solution. It was, they concluded, the only choice that gave the crew any chance of survival. A belly landing would have likely resulted in fire and casualties. Bailing out risked civilian deaths below. The compressed air gambit, despite its risks, had been the least worst option. The official report also commended the crew's discipline during the emergency. Not a single man panicked. Not a single man abandoned his post prematurely. They functioned as they'd been trained to function as a single organism with one purpose: bring everyone home. Captain Harrison received the Distinguished Flying Cross for airmanship under emergency conditions. Technical Sergeant O'Brien and Sergeant Mendoza both received the Soldier S Medal for risking their lives to save others. The entire crew received letters of commendation from the commanding general of the 8th Air Force. But the medals told only part of the story. The real legacy of Lady Luck's final flight played out in the decades that followed. First Lieutenant Chen recovered from his head injury and returned to flight status within 3 months. He flew 12 more missions before Germany surrendered in May 1945. After the war, he became a commercial airline pilot, eventually captaining Boeing 707s across the Pacific. He always told his passengers the same thing during pre-flight announcements: "We have the safest crew in aviation. Take care of each other." He flew without incident for 32 years before retiring. Technical Sergeant O'Brien's hands healed enough for him to return to his first love: rebuilding engines. He opened a motorcycle repair shop in Boston that became legendary for its quality work. On the shop wall hung a photograph of Lady Luck, taken before that final mission. Underneath, a simple caption: "Every machine has a soul. Respect it." Sergeant Mendoza returned to El Paso and became a high school shop teacher. For 40 years, he taught kids how to use tools safely, how to solve mechanical problems, how to never give up when something seemed impossible. On the last day of every school year, he told his students the story of the burning bomber and the axe that wouldn't quit cutting. Captain Harrison never flew again. His shattered leg healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp. But he didn't need to fly. He became an instructor at the Air Force's Survival Training School, teaching young pilots how to make impossible choices under pressure. His most famous lecture was titled, "When Everything Goes Wrong at 5,000 Feet." It was mandatory for all new bomber crews. The crew held reunions every year for 43 years until age and health made travel impossible. They came from all corners of America, California, Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, to spend a weekend together, remembering. They never talked much about the crash itself. Instead, they talked about everything that came after: wives, children, grandchildren, careers, the ordinary miracles of long lives well lived. At the 1990 reunion, when they were all in their 70s, someone suggested they visit RAF Lakenheath, see the runway where it happened. The base commander welcomed them personally, arranged a ceremony. They stood at the spot where Lady Luck had carved her furrow into the concrete long since repaired, but marked now with a small plaque: "In memory of the crew of Lady Luck, March 17, 1945. All 11 came home." Chen, his hair white now, his eyes still sharp, spoke for them all. "We were just doing our jobs. We were scared, sure, but we were trained, we were ready, and we were together. Not the compressed air, not the compressed air, not the emergency procedures. Each other." The B-29 program produced nearly 4,000 aircraft during World War II. They flew thousands of missions, carried millions of pounds of bombs, helped end the war. But of all those aircraft, of all those missions, none is remembered quite like the one that ended in a fireball on an English runway with 0 fatalities. Military aviation historians study the Lady Luck incident as a case study in crew resource management. Modern pilot training programs use it to teach decision-making under stress. Safety engineers examine the jury-rigged compressed air system to understand how desperate innovation can overcome mechanical failure. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler than all that. It's in the lesson that every military pilot carries forward. Take care of your crew, and your crew will take care of you. Make the hard choices. Use every tool you have, including the ones you invent on the spot. And never, ever give up when lives are on the line. Captain James Jimmy Doolittle Harrison died in 2003 at the age of 84. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids newspaper mentioned his distinguished flying cross, his years as an instructor, his contributions to aviation safety. But the last paragraph quoted something he'd said in an interview shortly before his death. "People asked me if I was scared that day. Of course I was scared. Fear is what keeps you sharp, keeps you thinking. But fear never made my decisions. My decisions were made by training, by responsibility, and by love for those 10 men depending on me." When your crew's lives are in your hands, You find strength you didn't know you had. When the landing gear jammed at 5,000 feet, Captain Harrison and the crew of Lady Luck faced the kind of choice that defines heroes, not the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it. Their story reminds us that the Second World War was fought not just by generals and armies, but by ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, people who found within themselves reserves of courage, ingenuity, and selflessness that even they didn't know existed. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Secrets Reborn as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. These men and women, from every nation, every background, every walk of life, shape the world we live in today. Their stories deserve to be remembered, honored, and passed down to future generations who will face their own impossible choices. Remember Lady Luck, remember her crew, and remember that in our darkest moments, when everything seems lost, human courage and determination can overcome even the most impossible odds.